So yeah, this article kind of, encapsulates and sort of summarizes a lot of things that we've talked about in class. Hopefully a lot of that will seem familiar to you. I didn't include a PowerPoint for this because I figure I should be able to, more or less summarize my own writing. I like to think it's a little easier to read probably than a lot of the other things that we've gone over in this class, although I do quote, fairly extensively from a lot of the critical theorists. I would also, I would like to say also that this article has been published, but it's in the, I guess, the process of being published. It's actually been submitted to, let me switch over here, to this journal right here, Mediations, Journal of the Marxist Literary Group. Now, I actually submitted this article a year ago, last April, and they basically sat on it for 10 months until February of this year, where they got back to me and they asked me to basically revise and resubmit the article again, which is actually kind of a good sign. I mean, most articles usually just get rejected. They say, better luck next time, essentially. Very, very few articles, actually get published outright. Most of the time you're going to get, a request to make some revisions. And, as long as you do that, they usually do publish the article. So I would, I think, most likely, I think that this article will end up getting published by this journal. Again, it's taken an enormous amount of time. 10 months is a pretty long time to wait, even by, the standards of this kind of academic peer review thing. I mean, the comments were essentially like they thought I used too many block quotes later on in the article, which I did change, and the version of the article here is the sort of the revised version of it. So I resubmitted again actually earlier this month in April. So it's already been like 3 weeks. I'm still waiting to hear back from them. So as much as I would love to say that this actually is a published article in a peer-reviewed scholarly journal, it isn't as of yet, but I think most likely it probably will be. Probably sounds like a little humble bragging on my part, but I just want people to know that this isn't just some random rantings and ravings I did in my own time. This actually has been sort of vetted and reviewed by other scholars, and at least passed some kind of scrutiny, I guess, to be considered serious scholarship. It is a kind of an interesting journal. You can read the articles for free, which is nice. A lot of these peer-reviewed journals are usually buried under some kind of paywall. I was actually looking at this article just before class. This is spring 2021. This is their most recent journal as well. Could you please provide the link to us after class? Yeah, I mean, it's what is it? Mediationsjournal.org. But yeah, I'll send the link out through after class. Like I was saying, I started reading this article just before class. Raymond Williams, Friedrich Hayek, and the New Legacy of the Cultural Turn. Raymond Williams was a Marxist cultural critic. Friedrich Hayek is an important free market economist, influential in the history of free market economics. And sort of, I didn't read the whole thing, but sort of, contrasting their, points of view, obviously from different, ends of the political spectrum. But again, like you can see, mostly all these articles are basically, free. You don't have to, pay for it or subscribe to the journal in order to be able to read it. I hope the journal doesn't go out of business or something like that. I mean, usually they publish twice a year. I don't know, they didn't publish anything this past fall. So, but again, I did hear from them in February. So as far as I know, they're still going. Anyway, though, so like I said, I didn't have a PowerPoint for this, but I thought I'd just basically go through the article real quickly. I did include another article from the New Yorker by Alex Ross, who I do quote in this article. You can read that as well. I probably won't spend too much time going over that. I've talked about the New Yorker, before, especially in a critical light of some of its, stances on, the invasion of Iraq, the lack of accountability that the editor of the magazine is still there, and I feel like as well as publishing other pro-war articles back in that period of time as well. I include that article because, I'm not trying to say, of course, that there's nothing worth reading in the New Yorker or the New York Times or anything like that. They do, occasionally publish things worth reading, I suppose. At the same time, frankly, I feel like there are other publications that you can read that have, high level cultural and political analysis of things and articles that you can read that don't have as much, that aren't as highly compromised as a lot of these, highbrow, elite liberal publications. And I guess, quite frankly, I don't really have that much patience to kind of sift through these things anymore and try to, dig out what's worth reading from what's not worth reading. So I don't really read the New Yorker anymore. I never really did that much. I did, I guess, briefly have a subscription to it. I used to read, the New York Times and the Washington Post almost every day, especially when you could read the articles for free online. Now, of course, you can't do that, or you're limited. But like I said, this kind of goes back to what we were talking about with the public sphere. I think there are lots of different, alternative sources of media out there now, of news and information that you can get, and you don't have to, the so-called liberal media doesn't have as an exclusive a monopoly on things anymore, on what we read and the access to information that we have. But I do think, the article by Alex Ross is worth reading. So let me get into this. So essentially what this article is about, it kind of sort of reevaluates, as the title says, this sort of split between critical theory, otherwise known as the Frankfurt School, and what they referred to as vulgar Marxists. And the idea being, of course, that these so-called vulgar Marxists were people who didn't have the same kind of, sophisticated approach to culture that you would see in critical theory. And, simply put, I kind of set out to argue, well, that's not actually the case. If you look at a lot of these Marxists, people who are much more, sort of overtly or explicitly Marxist, a lot of them actually do have a pretty sort of sophisticated analysis of culture, which I do try to include some examples of that. And that, although I do think that the approach to culture, the dialectical approach to culture, developed by theorists like Adorno and Horkheimer and Marcuse as well, although interesting, and I do think have many valuable insights, I think they do kind of, they are sort of inconsistent in that, and that they are so dismissive towards mass culture, towards popular culture, a term they don't even like to use, right? I mean, again, if we go back to the term the culture industry, Adorno and Horkheimer came up with that term because they don't even like to refer to it as mass culture, and certainly not popular culture. I think if you're consistently applying a dialectical approach, though, and as I've said before, the dialectical theory or method means that you sort of look at the positive and negative aspects of things, how they sort of interrelate to each other. Then, I mean, to be dialectical regarding mass culture, it means that you have to, yes, be critical of it, but also recognize that there are, legitimate expressions that come out of that as well, that do come close to what Adorno said that art should do, which is to raise a protest against a petrified society, as he calls it. And I do think that there are examples of that, even if they're not very many. Even if you're willing to say that 90% of mass culture, and even 99% of mass culture, is basically crap and trash, there's still at least, there are at least some sort of, hidden gems that exist out there, and maybe during different periods of time, there may be more. I mean, maybe the cultural sort of landscape that we live in now is fairly bleak. I'll admit that's kind of how I sort of view it. But I think during previous periods of time, related to different periods of when you see sort of a rise in political protests, and when you see sort of an emergent, political left and, labor movements in this country, it does seem to correlate with a more vibrant, more, interesting popular culture than in periods of time where you see sort of, conservatives on the rise and sort of corporate power on the rise. That being said, I still think you can probably find some sort of, hidden gems out there that still sort of exist within our popular culture. And even if that sounds largely dismissive, it's still at least a little more subtle and nuanced than what, Adorno is basically offering here, where he's, essentially 100% dismissive over all aspects of mass culture. Excuse me. So that's kind of where I sort of, take that. And by the way, I mean, I hope also, even though this is a longer essay, I hope you can still at least sort of see the basic structure of writing a political theory essay that you would more or less follow in writing your own papers for this class, even though it's much smaller, only 5 to 7 pages. Essentially, I'm still kind of following that structure, which is that I'm taking a position regarding some of the political theorists that we have covered in this class. In this case, Adorno and Horkheimer, mostly Adorno, with a little bit of Marcuse thrown in there as well. And I'm essentially taking a position on what they say, either agree, disagree, or partly agree. And of course, in this case, I partly agree. In other words, I do think they have, like I said, valuable insights, but I do think they are, wrong in some other areas. And in order to, support that argument, I bring in other theorists, including some of these so-called vulgar Marxist theorists, as well as Benjamin, who was, like I said, somewhat more sort of ambivalent, had somewhat more sort of, mixed feelings towards mass culture. Okay. And with some reference to Lukács as well. So, so basically, the so-called vulgar Marxist idea is usually identified with the Soviet Union, usually identified, in fact, with Stalinism. And it's this idea that, culture isn't important. All that really matters is economics. Culture is so much that it exists in society, basically just mechanically reflects the interest of the ruling class. So in a bourgeois society like the United States, all culture is basically just going to reflect the interests of the ruling class, and and essentially brainwash people into accepting ruling class values for the most part, whether it's popular culture or even the so-called fine arts like painting and literature and things like that. In other words, the kind of stuff that Adorno tends to champion, and that either way, culture really doesn't matter all that much. All that really matters are economics and statistics that speak to those kinds of things. And, I do think that is true to a certain extent. I mean, certainly, coming out of the Soviet Union, that would be, for the most part, it would seem like the kind of approach that you would see out of a lot of, theorists or people who were sort of writing in the Soviet Union. They're concerned with, how many, tons of steel was produced last year and things like that, and not at all concerned with, painting and literature and all these other things. So I do think that, there's some truth to that idea of what they call vulgar Marxism, but, obviously it's exaggerated. And I think not all Marxists, not all people who would be considered, a so-called orthodox Marxist or would identify with that label, obviously are, in alignment with the Soviet Union, with the policies of the Soviet Union. Even people like Leon Trotsky, right, who was one of the leaders of the Russian Revolution, had a massive falling out with Stalin. And, that's an understatement. I mean, he was basically later, executed, most likely on Stalin's orders, as were many other leaders of the Russian Revolution. Trotsky had made it out of Russia by that point, but was eventually, sort of tracked down and killed. But Trotskyism as a political movement, basically has always been critical of the Soviet Union. Although, and it just sort of, splits off into various different offshoots and things like that. But some are more, let's say, advocates of third world revolution, or what would have been called third world revolution back then, Cuba and Vietnam and things like that. Some are critical of all these movements. Some are, more or less critical of the Soviet Union. Some thought that there was, even though the Soviet Union kind of went wrong, there was a basic foundation of a worker state, that did provide certain kinds of, social rights to people and things like that. So there are various different offshoots of that. I mean, I would say right off the bat, that's one of the mistakes of this idea, is that, vulgar Marxism tends to paint things, too broadly, right? And that's an idea it's like one group representing critical theory, and then there's another group representing vulgar Marxists. But really, the people who identify themselves as Marxists are fit into different various groups as well. Yeah, okay. So that's that. Again, I would say the most important legacy of the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory is the idea of the culture industry, of course, is the analysis of mass culture in general. Marx dies in 1883. Engels dies about 12 years after that, 1895. So by the time that they had passed away, I mean, you didn't really have a mass culture. I mean, things like movies and television and radio and things like that really did not exist. So it only seems logical that as time goes by, that you would want to analyze and try to understand these things. But by sort of, through applying a kind of Marxist analysis to things, which means, of course, by analyzing these things in terms of being commodities. And essentially what happens when you sort of inject the commodity form, or what happens when you sort of refashion these things, culture and art, into commodities. And of course, you had literature and things like that, of course, during Marx's days. But the idea of sort of mass culture that could, speak to, large groupings of people, millions of people, which you could only really do through mass communication and mass media, really did not exist during the period of time. So the simple question that they ask is, what happens when those things are sort of oriented around the profit motive? That these things are sort of produced in order to make a profit. And what happens, more often than not, is you have a kind of a lowering of the standards of culture. You have a culture that's very risk adverse. You have a culture that's not going to want to push the envelope, challenge the status quo, challenge popular prejudices, because doing all those things threatens to undermine your profits, right? I mean, more people will be turned off to it, and you'll be less profitable, basically. So what you have instead is a culture that constantly sort of caters to popular prejudices, caters to the opinions that people already have, cater to what's already familiar to people. And what you get is a very sort of stagnant culture, right? You get a culture that's kind of dumbs people down, and in its worst forms tends to brainwash people, right? Tends to become just another tool to sort of condition people to accept the establishment. I feel like there's something else I want to say about the Frankfurt School, but I forget. Oh, and again, this is something that I've already said, but one of the themes here, of course, is that as critical theory goes on and on, it starts off by applying a kind of Marxist analysis to culture that's very heavily influenced by Marx. But as time goes on, you start to see it sort of move further and further away from that, right? To the point where the proletariat, the working class, no longer has, the central importance that it did for Marx, of course. The idea that you could even abolish capitalism, the idea that you could even create a socialist or communist society building out of the achievements of capitalism, but sort of going beyond that as well. Even that idea gets abandoned after a while. The idea that class conflict or class struggle is an important motive, or is the most important motivating conflict within society. All that gets sort of pushed to the wayside. And as I've already said, I think one of the directions that critical theory should move in is obviously to go back to those things. There's, the class conflict has kind of come back with a vengeance in many ways, owing to the massive growth of inequality, the massive growth of corporate power, and things like that over the last several decades, in fact. But while also sort of, building on this analysis of mass culture, which I think is very, interesting. So again, they're influenced by Lukács's idea of reification. This idea that consciousness becomes something that's like thingified. Consciousness becomes something that sort of loses its flexibility and malleability. That certain values, like bourgeois values, that you forget they come out of a kind of historical context, and that you tend to take them for granted as being, normal and natural and pretty much the only way of, sort of looking at the world. That the culture industry more or less does that, right? It sort of, it sort of conditions people to sort of accept bourgeois values of politics and economics in an uncritical way. You just sort of accept it as normal and natural. I would also say that a lot of, so-called social science kind of does that as well in economics, but also in political science. And, it is interesting because this is a political science class. I have a degree in political science, yet I feel like this stuff very, poorly fits into the overall sort of realm of political science, which is to say, political philosophy, but really a specific area of political philosophy, basically Marxism and theories that kind of come out of that. Most of political science, if anyone here is a political science major, you probably have some idea of what the rest of, or what most of political science is about: international relations, comparative politics, American politics, for the most part. I mean, you could argue that most of political science also kind of reifies, right? It also sort of represents this reification of bourgeois values. In that, what I mean by that is that you sort of take, for granted sort of, bourgeois idea or capitalist ideas of politics and economics, a bourgeois idea of democracy, a bourgeois idea of how the economy is supposed to work, and kind of does the worst thing possible, which is that you sort of take these ideas which have a very specific, class background and speak to a very specific kind of class perspective, and really sort of advance the interest of a specific class, and present it as if it's kind of, sort of impartial science, and kind of conceals that sort of class nature of those things. Honestly, I would say that a lot of, political science does kind of do that, right? You have a kind of bourgeois idea. I mean, just, the fact that you take for granted the idea that the capitalist governments or the democratic governments, that the socialist governments, or the ones that call themselves socialists at least, are non-democratic. Most political scientists, at least in the United States, take those ideas, fairly uncritically. There's not much sort of, questioning of those core foundations. Most, international relations theorists, again, sort of take it for granted that the so-called international order created by the United States after World War II and with its, allies, is this, wonderful thing that has to be, preserved at all costs, even though it perpetuates the dependence of, poorer countries on the wealthier countries, even though the hierarchy of sort of rich states or rich nations and poor nations has barely changed since the end of World War II. The countries that were wealthy countries prior to World War II are still wealthy countries today, even though a couple of them had to be rebuilt after World War II. But the poorer countries that existed prior to World War II were still, for the most part, poorer countries today. The one most notable, exception to that, of course, is China. And of course, that's the one country that largely has ignored or defied or very selectively, applied so-called Western norms of politics and economics and things like that. I mean, not even politics at all, really, but, some economic policies, but has also really, ignored many sort of, Western norms on how the economy is supposed to be run and things like that. So I feel like a lot of political scientists don't really question those things. A lot of them take for granted the idea that, the US is this kind of, force for good in the world and stands for freedom and democracy and things like that. So, and again, these could all be sort of seen as examples of what Lukács would call reification. So as a student, it was kind of, sort of mind-blowing to be learning about these ideas literally at almost the exact same time I'm also taking classes, which kind of sort of represent this kind of reification of bourgeois values and, reification of, capitalist concepts of politics and economics and things like that. So, and I mean, that's one reason why the idea of reification is an important idea. but also, as it fits into, the idea of culture as well. So as I say here, a term like mass culture, even more so popular culture, implies an authentic, spontaneous culture created by the people. The culture industry is the exact opposite. Culture becomes another commodity created by corporate committees and computer algorithms administered to the populace for the purpose of both realizing exchange value and fostering social conformity and resignation to the status quo. Remember, Adorno often speaks about the idea of the administered world, right, or the administered society. And that's kind of the idea here, is a culture becomes just something that is sort of managed at the top, and just sort of, essentially given to the people or administered to the people as a means of kind of keeping them under control, basically. And you sort of get this, constant sort of, reinforcement of status quo values and things like that. The culture industry fuses the old and familiar into a new quality in all its branches, products which are tailored for consumption by masses and which to a great extent determine the nature of that consumption are manufactured more or less according to plan. That's a quote from Dialectic of Enlightenment. The masses are little more than an appendage of the machinery. So, and of course, this sort of changes the basic idea of art. So the philosopher Immanuel Kant believed that art represented, or aesthetics, basically represent purposiveness without purpose. And what that means basically is that you have people spending enormous amounts of time and labor and energy basically doing something that doesn't have any real purpose to it, which is essentially what art is. You think of Van Gogh or Picasso or whoever, or Charles Dickens or Herman Melville, or whoever, spending enormous amounts of time. Oftentimes, things which would have an adverse effect on their health even, because they would have sleepless nights and they would become so, invested in what they were doing. And the sort of laborious attention to detail and things like that. It's not doing anything for them in an economic sense, right? They're not getting rich off of this. I mean, many of these people, Picasso did actually, Picasso and Dickens did actually find some success in life. But Melville and Van Gogh did not, and many other artists, of course, did not. And you have to almost marvel at that kind of, almost like obsessiveness that they were willing to, go through with these things, even though, it really served no other purpose other than, I guess, creating art, other than a need to create, some great work of art, which of course has, stood the test of time and in many cases, got them posthumous fame, right? They became famous after they were dead, of course, when they're not in a position to enjoy that anymore. And that's long story short, that's kind of the idea of art, right? That it's this immense concentration of energy and effort and labor into something which doesn't really serve any practical purpose. That gets sort of inverted by the culture industry. And now you have purposelessness for purposes, basically stuff that's, not created with any great care or energy or effort, stuff that's kind of churned out, right? Adorno, several points, makes note of the fact that, culture within the culture industry is standardized. And even though it doesn't literally come off a factory assembly line, it might as well have, right? It's just sort of churned out, product being churned out, for the purposes of making money, basically. Of course, that's what he means by purposelessness for purposes. Now it does serve a purpose, right? The purpose, of course, is to make money. It serves a practical purpose now, even though the quality of what's being churned out is very low in most cases. Comic books would be a great example of that, right? Many of the sort of independent alternative cartoonists publish very infrequently. And the reason for that, of course, is that, producing these things, writing and drawing these comics are extremely time consuming, labor intensive stuff. I can't draw, to save my life, basically, but I've seen people do it, or I've seen people talk about, the process that goes along with that. It's extremely time consuming. If you just isolate one panel, you think how long it takes putting down the, the pencil line and then the ink line and everything else. It's an enormous amount of effort. Mainstream comics, the kind of stuff that's published by Marvel and DC Comics, those things are churned out on a monthly basis. Whereas a lot of the alternative cartoonists, they may publish like once or twice a year, maybe. I mean, and it's because of the immense labor that goes into that, and the fact that it's basically their entire creative vision. Whereas a mainstream comic, corporate comics, in other words, usually have a separate writer, a separate penciler, a separate inker, a separate person doing the lettering, writing the fonts on the page, a separate person, coloring the comic if it is colored. And then you have an editor and a chief. So it does in very many ways sort of resemble that kind of factory-like, division of labor, where you have one task that's sort of, broken up among, 6 or 7 other people doing the same work essentially of one person. And of course, the reasons for that are not to produce better quality stuff, but basically just to churn out, a product basically on a monthly basis. The more product you have, the more profits that you're going to make. And of course, a similar example would apply for most other, aspects of art as well. So again, as it says, the culture industry transfers the profit motive naked onto cultural forms. Even pure works of art, which negated the commodity character of society simply by following their own inherent laws, were at the same time always commodities. Now that's another important point. I think Adorno kind of has to admit to a certain, or has to concede to a certain extent. So he's clearly a champion of the so-called classical art forms, highbrow stuff, elitist stuff, the avant-garde, the stuff that's not really for popular consumption, right? But even that stuff always was to some extent a commodity as well. I mean, many of the great artists of the past and many of the great, artists who, sort of operate outside of, the popular marketplace and things like that, they have to make a living, right? They have to find a way to pay their bills and things like that. And the mechanism of sales and producing these things in exchange for money has always existed, right? Even for the kind of art forms that Adorno would largely champion. His way out of that, of course, is to say, like, well, they had that aspect to a certain extent, but that wasn't what they were really about. They were mostly just about producing their own art. Whether they were popular or not was of a secondary concern. Whereas art, whereas culture that's produced within the culture industry is a commodity through and through, right? It's only about making money, basically. And any kind of artistic considerations are purely secondary at best. Again, cultural entities typical of, as you can see, I use a lot of quotes here. Again, for a smaller paper, 5 to 7 pages, you don't have to use as many quotes. If you do, I often try to kind of, sort of weave the quote into the sentence, or sort of, add my own context to kind of make the quote make a little more sense. I mean, that's something that I guess you get better at the more you do it. Not that I'm saying I'm that great at it, but when you read a lot of these, academic published texts and things like that, that's kind of how they do it. But cultural entities typical of the culture industry are no longer also commodities. They are commodities through and through. For Adorno and Horkheimer, all mass culture under monopoly is identical. Those in charge no longer take much trouble to conceal the structure, the power of which increases the more bluntly its existence is admitted. The truth that they are nothing but business is used as an ideology to legitimize the trash they intentionally produce. And again, that's their term for it. They refer to it as trash. In doing so, the negation, the determinate negation, that's an Adorno term, basically. I'll admit that's a little jargony, it's a little technical jargon, but basically saying the sort of the critical content that art is supposed to provide for people, that raised the protest against the petrified relations under which they lived, is compromised and instead reproduces the ideas of the ruling elite. The culture industry breeds conformity, passivity, and relentlessly drills the values of the status quo into people's minds. Skip over a little bit. Although it would be hard to argue that the operators of this vast apparatus are unaware of the tendency to undermine the resistance to capitalism, the commodification of culture also practically guarantees this result, even if it was not intentional. So this is something that I've often kind of, struggled with or wondered about. I mean, it's the idea that just by producing culture for profit, that you create an incentive to, again, produce what's already familiar to people, to sort of reinforce popular prejudices and things like that. But I mean, at some point, you have to think that the people that are sort of operating these vast culture industries, the movie studios and the television networks and the big publishing conglomerates and things like that, they must somewhat be aware of what they're doing, right? I mean, and of course, they are also part of the capitalist class, right? These are the owners, not the people that work there, not the actors and directors and writers that work for them, but the actual owners of these things. I mean, they are capitalists. They must be aware of the fact that this stuff undermines the resistance to capitalism. So at a certain point, you have to think it must be intentional, right? That they must be consciously producing stuff that they know is going to sort of, I don't know how to say it, but, brainwash people basically into accepting capitalism, even though it is an economic system, which, objectively can be showed does not work out in the, interest of most people, that it actually, leaves most people impoverished, essentially, or at least, buried in debt and just barely getting by. Not to mention alienated and, all these other things, while a very small group of people, profit off of this. I mean, they must be aware of that to a certain extent. But I guess the idea is that even if they weren't somehow, that just the incentive to produce culture for a profit rather than, creating art that would actually sort of challenge people to think, kind of creates that situation anyway. So as it says, the need to make cultural products profitable creates a strong incentive to cater to popular prejudices. Works that would challenge these views would not be popular and thus not profitable. Works that have proven to be popular become a formula for producing culture that's endlessly copied, not at all different from an industrial product coming off an assembly line. So of course we see whenever something does occasionally strike a chord with people, in no time at all, there are dozens of imitators and copycats. I mean, one of my favorite examples is after the movie Pulp Fiction came out, the Quentin Tarantino movie, right? It was his second movie, his first movie, independent movie, Reservoir Dogs. Successful, I guess. Obviously, is what got him to make Pulp Fiction. When Pulp Fiction came out, though, it really caused quite a stir. It was a very popular movie. It was different than a lot of other movies that had come out during that period of time. I liked Tarantino as a director. I like, all the movies I've seen of him. I think I've seen all of his movies except the most recent one. Pulp Fiction is still probably my favorite movie, though. But after that movie came out, I mean, there were so many movies that came out that tried to sort of copy that, Tarantino-esque energy to it. The quirky dialogue, the, offbeat plots, the offbeat characters and things like that. I mean, you kind of really have to be there at the time to know what I'm talking about. So maybe it's not the best example, but those are kind of like the stylistic traits of Tarantino, even now, right? The characters kind of talk and act in different ways that you see in most other movies. Of course, Pulp Fiction was kind of a crime drama, so I saw a lot of other movies coming out like that, and really trying hard to be cute and smart and all that other stuff. Movies like, I mean, you can even sort of tell by like the title that they were trying to be like that, like a movie called 2 Days in the Valley. Probably one of the most ridiculous examples is a movie called like Things to Do in Denver When You're Dead. And so, usually movies have fairly short titles, right? But we're going to have long titles that are hard to remember because that's offbeat and quirky, just like, Quentin Tarantino. And again, they'd be crime dramas and they'd have these characters that kind of speak in this very forced, hip dialogue and things like that. I mean, that's one example of it. There are any number of examples that you can point to it. When all alternative music and punk rock became popular in the 90s, you have all these, cookie cutter pop punk bands sort of following in their wake. Same thing with hip hop. Gangster rap becomes a popular thing, and all of a sudden you have all these guys, talking about guns and, dressing up a certain way and things like that. And I'm sure that's probably still true, today. I mean, I don't really pay that much attention to popular culture anymore, but that has always kind of been the case, right? I mean, even going back several decades before that, when the Beatles came out, there were like a million bands, coming out trying to sound like the Beatles. So that is, sort of always been the case with popular culture. So even when you do have something new, something that doesn't sound like the same old stuff, it quickly sort of gets co-opted. It quickly sort of gets absorbed into this sort of giant blob that is the culture industry, basically. The history of mass culture since Adorno's time at least partially confirms this argument, though with some reservations. Even works produced within mass culture that do occasionally challenge established views usually fail to find an audience. I would say Orson Welles would be a good example of that. He was somebody that was making, films meant for popular consumption, films produced by a Hollywood studio, but did not, at least initially, become popular movies. Maybe they did later on. Citizen Kane, for example. Although, there is kind of a story to that as well, which I don't really go into in this article, but William Randolph Hearst, who, the film is supposed to be loosely based upon, who was still alive at the time this movie came out, very powerful newspaper publisher, if you're not familiar with him, apparently used all of his political power, all his power and leverage basically to kind of crush this film, to make it hard to distribute, hard to put in theaters. So the fact that it was not popular, that it failed to find an audience, I mean, may not have happened in an organic way either. It may not have been necessarily people were just not interested in the movie, but there was a deliberate attempt basically to kind of, squash this movie, which was successful. Another example would be, a TV show like The Sopranos, which of course was a popular show. And I think does have, some interesting ideas, behind it, but it seems like, and is somewhat, critical of bourgeois society and culture. But sorry, my allergies are bothering me again today. But you kind of have to, whatever intellectual content there is there, whatever kind of critical views are there, have to kind of be sort of hidden almost behind this veneer of sex and violence and things which kind of, would appeal more to a mass audience. Sopranos, I think, is a perfect example of that, right? I mean, a lot of people think The Sopranos is just about, a bunch of cool guys doing cool things, as one person put it, and they just purely, respond to the kind of, the mafia stuff and the violence and the nudity. It's an HBO show. You could show some nudity there and things like that, and the gratuitous violence. And I think that's probably, why the show became maybe as popular as it did. It also appealed to people maybe on another level who did sort of, appreciate the critique of, suburban lifestyles and, the kind of, late 20th century American, lifestyles, going into the 21st century, of course. And the show, the show started in 1999 and did become a lot darker, after September 11th and the invasion of Iraq and things like that. It's also a pretty good example of how ridiculous censorship is here in this country. Has anyone ever tried to watch it on basic cable or something like that, where they censor all the curses and stuff? I mean, it's literally an unwatchable show. I can't imagine how anyone could watch that show from start to finish. I'm not trying to knock anyone that doesn't have HBO. I didn't have HBO growing up. In fact, my parents got it, who were fans of the show before I was. Got it basically to watch The Sopranos. I was almost like a senior in high school when the show came out. So I did not grow up having HBO either. But having seen it now on regular cable, they used to play on an A&E network, Arts and Entertainment, by the way. And I mean, if you've ever seen the show, they're constantly cursing, but they change it all. All the F-bombs become freak you or forget you. So you'll have guys going back and forth saying, forget you. Yeah, forget you. Forget you, you mother forgetter. It's why even play that? I mean, either play the show uncensored or just don't play it. Anyway, I mean, that's kind of a side note, but even the point being is that even shows that may have some ideas, behind them, that they kind of sort of, and maybe sort of try to have their cake and eat it too. It's like they want to make a smart show, quote unquote smart show, that will appeal to people, but you also kind of have to give, people what they want as well. You got to give them a pretty healthy dosage of, sex and violence and things like that to keep that large audience around. Otherwise, the show probably won't do that well. So, I do feel that does at least kind of partially confirm what Adorno is talking about, right? Which is that, although you can, at least under some circumstances, produce works in the realm of mass culture that have some worthwhile ideas, behind them, more often than not, things that are produced in a popular format that are a little more challenging fail to find an audience, at least initially. Maybe later on they gain a reputation, or you kind of have to try to sort of have your cake and eat it too. You maybe want to have some smart ideas in there, but you also got to give people what they want as well. So I think that's a partial, it kind of speaks to what Adorno is talking about, but I do think he also tends to be way too dismissive, basically, over mass culture. So Adorno says that the style of the culture industry provides a facsimile of reality through the application of photographic realism and slick use of technical details to create the appearance of objective reality while smuggling in the subjective interests of those who wield the vast technical apparatus of the culture industry, who in turn are beholden to even larger corporate interests. So what he's saying here is that the way in which the culture industry works is that it doesn't always beat you over the head with the propaganda as well, right? More often than not, it tries to present itself as being objective, right? We're not telling you what to think. We're just sort of, presenting things the way they are. And the way it does that is through making things look as realistic as possible, basically, or at least making things look as, technically as proficient as possible. So you'll think of movies that are very, it doesn't look like they're doing a lot of, weird stuff, camera tricks and things like that. It's just sort of giving you a more or less, standard viewpoint of things. Or even, documentary films and things like that. But, what often happens is that the sort of the biases, the class interests and things like that are sort of put there in a very sort of, subtle way, while not, drawing a lot of attention to it. And of course, the people that run the culture industry, the movie studios and things like that, they themselves are, of course, subject to the whims of even larger corporations like banks. And, like I said, General Electric for years owned NBC, one of the largest, consumer manufacturers of electronics, but also a major military contractor as well. And even to this day, they still own, a minority share, by the way, in NBC as well. Joseph Goebbels, the minister of propaganda for the Nazis, had a similar approach, right? His approach to propaganda was that, you don't want to sort of like front load. You don't want to like overload people with propaganda. It's very obvious and very, like almost like hitting you over the head with how obvious it is. He, in fact, preferred movies that would be sort of light entertainment, just sort of, comedies even and things like that, and action adventure movies and things like that, but would have the propaganda kind of snuck in a very sort of subtle way, so that you wouldn't really notice, for example, that the women in the movie would always be sort of, subordinate to the men or something like that. It's not like we're going to explicitly make a movie about, how bad women are or something like that's not going to be like the explicit focus of the movie, but it'll just sort of be there in the background and we won't really call attention to it, but it'll just kind of be there. Just like how in a lot of, 1950s sitcoms and things like that, nobody really questioned the idea that, the man goes out to work and the woman stays home in the kitchen and raises the kids and things like that. They're not really calling attention to it. They're not making a whole show about it and explicitly bringing it up. It's just sort of always there in the background. And of course, you could apply that to various other things, race relations, sexual identity and things like that. Excuse me. Now you have this, controversy about, Disney is supposedly, sexualizing kids and things like that. And they talk about teachers doing that as well. But what they're really saying is that they just want to go back to the same old, homophobic, heteronormative culture of the past, where it was just quote unquote normal to be, heterosexual, for example. And you just never even talked about anything else that would sort of, go against that social norm. I mean, those would be some examples, at least, of how, you kind of present this appearance of objective reality while sort of sneaking in stealthily the kind of, viewpoints of the, the ruling class and the ruling elite. So speaking again of, form and content. So, the style would speak to the, the formal aspects of things, right? But what is the actual content, right? So the genuine work of art, according to Adorno, nevertheless, the formal aspects of style predominate. Instead, true art incorporates the dialectic of form and content. Its technique is concerned with the internal organization of the object itself, with its inner logic, meaning that you write a book or you paint a picture or, you make a movie, not just thinking of like what's going to, make me the most money, basically, but you think about like what goes into making, what goes into writing a great book? What do I have to do to write a great book? And oftentimes to write a great book, you have to read a lot of books. You have to figure out what the great books were before that, right? Almost every great, I think every great writer is also a great reader, right? You have to read a lot if you want to be a great writer. And that goes into that. You figure out what they do. And then you kind of get a sense of, well, what else could be done? Where could you sort of, push things to the next level? And all those things are completely different than, just like, well, what's going to make me the most money? What's going to, cater to the largest possible audience and make me the most possible amount of money. On the relationship between form and content, Adorno writes, even works which are called classical, like the music of Mozart, contain objective tendencies which resist the style they incarnate. Up to Schoenberg and Picasso, great artists have been mistrustful of style, which at decisive points has guided them less than the logic of the subject matter. What the expressionists and the Dadaists attacked in their polemics, the untruth of style as such, triumphs today in the vocal jargon of the crooner, in the adept grace of the film star, and even in the mastery of a photographic shot of a farm laborer's hovel. So again, what we would call this is, style without substance, basically. So he talks about the vocal jargon of the crooner. I wonder if he has somebody like Frank Sinatra in mind, who would have been popular, I think, in the 1940s, early 1940s. But today it could be, a boy band, or it could be, anybody else, people who have, technical skill, but they have nothing to say. They have no, they're not raising a protest against a petrified society, as Adorno would say, which you could see in the paintings of a Picasso, for example, whether something is more overtly political, like Guernica, which we talked about in class, or something more abstract and ambiguous, like Girl Before a Mirror. And even things that are not as overtly political, you could still say are kind of raising that protest, because they're going against the sort of, solidified norms and values of a society. They're intended to provoke. And of course, you can see that oftentimes in the kind of, backwards attitudes that people have towards Picasso paintings and other things like that. I mean, how many times have you heard people say like, oh, I could do that. I could paint that. My kid's finger painting looks like that, Jackson Pollock painting or something like that. So, I mean, those things are, provocative, even if they're not, explicitly political. So again, style without substance, I think, an idea that most people get and understand to some extent. You see it in a lot of movies. Again, technically made, technically proficient, not saying anything, just kind of, reaffirming the, the status quo. I often think of, Christopher Nolan movies like that. Christopher Nolan, good director, in terms of the technical aspects of filmmaking, but his films tend to, have a kind of, conservative slant. I would say they tend to be very respectful of authority figures, at least in, in the words of one film critic, and I think that's kind of true. But anyway, I don't want to spend too much time on that. But the takeaway is basically, style over substance, basically. All sizzle and no steak would be. I actually, yeah, even include that at the end of the paragraph. All sizzle and no steak. Another kind of common expression of that. Formalism, or the overemphasis of form over content, also plays out in the political arena, which correlates with the degenerating effects of the culture industry, especially as the line between politics and culture become indistinguishable. So here's where I think that the sort of, dumbing down of culture, or the brainwashing effects of culture, also sort of play themselves out in the political arena as well. Which, if it didn't do that, then I think you could possibly say, well, these are just, artistic elitists, and they have their highfalutin views on culture and things like that. But I think, Adorno's quite good at showing that there is a definite sort of political effect to this, that the culture industry does, besides sort of, lowering people's standards towards art and culture, also sort of conditions people to accept the political status quo, as well as whatever, values are, popular within art or culture. Adorno and Horkheimer build on the Tocquevillian idea of the tyranny of the majority, someone who we didn't really talk about in class. Formal freedom is guaranteed for everyone, but, Tocqueville is an important political theorist who wrote the book, Democracy in America. Dennis Bathory may still teach. He used to teach a seminar on Tocqueville. He's in the political science faculty here. It's worth taking if you have the chance to. No one has to answer officially for what he or she thinks. However, all find themselves enclosed from early on within a system of churches, clubs, professional associations, and other relationships, which amounts to the most sensitive instrument of social control. So in theory, we're all guaranteed freedom, but there's such a conformity, and a kind of like peer pressure that exists among people that, very few people are willing to even express a point of view that goes outside of, what most people already think. And I would say that's even more, probably even more so back when they were writing, in the 1940s. Formalism is still the stock and trade of most American political science and politics in general, where an allegedly competitive political system, universal suffrage, and a basic scheme of constitutional rights are all that is required to categorize a regime as democratic. So in other words, we have formal democracy without the actual content of democracy. The content being, a government which actually ruled in the interests of the majority of people and enacted policies which were, supported by the interests of people and were to the benefit of the majority of people. In actuality, the choices between parties represent little more than a choice between Coke or Pepsi, where it's impossible to vote against the interests of Wall Street or the Pentagon. Aware of the futility, barely half, often less, of the electorate shows up to vote in a system where voting rights are insecurely held and the democratic principle of one person, one vote is undermined by institutions like the Electoral College. Constitutional rights, which have never consistently been applied for minorities, it's a bit of an understatement on my part, in all honesty, have increasingly been circumvented by the government's expanding mandate over national security, which are rubber stamped by compliant courts. In other words, basically since 9/11 and even before then, all of the constitutional rights, First Amendment rights, Fourth Amendment rights, protection against searches and seizures, all that stuff means, basically nothing anymore, right? The government can violate it anytime it wants to. And of course, and I probably should have included that here also, but of course, in America, our constitutional rights are much more limited, as I've already said, in many other countries, which include a right to healthcare and education and housing and things like that. Yet all this goes unnoticed when democracy and freedom are defined only in terms of form. Instead, everyone must show that they identify wholeheartedly with the power which beats them and join in the celebration of fake democracy. Sheldon Wolin, who was also a noted Tocqueville scholar, expanded on this in his theory of inverted totalitarianism, which we talked about last class. Corporate totalitarianism, another way of expressing the same concept, seeks to explain how the formal veneer of democracy can survive even while the substantive content has been drained away, expressing Wolin's inversion, okay, where economics dictates politics instead of politics dictating economics. Adorno and Horkheimer focus on a theme that still resonates today. True freedom is traded for consumerism. So people basically give up real freedom, meaning, having basic human rights and things like that, not being alienated, in the workplace and in society as a whole, in exchange for whatever, creature comforts and things like that you're able, the system basically gives you. The lack of freedom, though still evident, was relatively unproblematic for the hetero white male majority, of course, and concealed by the post-war era of unbridled American prosperity. In the neoliberal era, the lack of freedom is apparent. So, even white men in the 1950s weren't really free. I mean, they really had no actual say in anything that the government actually did, but most people didn't really care, or most of them didn't really care because, they had a high standard of living, relatively speaking. Well, and that, I mean, basically that they had a good standard of living. So they didn't really care about the lack of freedom. Nowadays, where that prosperity, what Marcuse would call the affluent society has more or less crumbled, at least for the, vast majority of people. Now the lack of freedom is very obvious. And again, is apparent as a helpless populace is cannibalized by the contradictions of capitalism with its obscene profit-driven healthcare system, the rise of household debt, especially student loan debt, deteriorating living standards, the lack of any significant initiative against climate change, and an unaccountable national security state that stumbles from one failed imperialistic adventure to another, to name just some of the mounting dysfunctions of contemporary American society. To the extent that a significant share of the public remains in a stupor, it is only because the culture industry still stimulates the unsublimated desires of the populace. A similar line of analysis was pursued by Herbert Marcuse in One Dimensional Man, arguably the most influential proponent of critical theory along with Adorno and Horkheimer. Like Adorno, Marcuse draws on Freudian theory to focus on the effects of mass culture that he termed repressive desublimation, or the pseudo-liberation, in other words, the fake liberation of sexual and aggressive impulses in order to foster social conformity. Or as I've said before, people will trade away real freedom, human rights, and things like that in order to watch boobs on television and, drive a loud car, or drive a, an aggressive vehicle of some sort. As Adorno would write, the culture industry is pornographic and prudish, comparing it to the ritual of Tantalus, both stimulating and denying erotic pleasure, with the goal always being to foster conformity and repression. By providing the endlessly familiar, it flatters the prejudices of the masses, conditioning them to satisfy their needs through the proliferation of consumer products, who insist unwaveringly on the ideology by which they are enslaved. The pernicious love of the common people for the harm done to them outstrips even the cunning of the authorities. So despite these insights, critical theory did fall out of favor for many years. After the fall of the Soviet Union, 1989, or well, 1991, but 1989 is generally considered the end of the Cold War, I think. It was eclipsed by the triumph of free market capitalism, but there are signs this is changing. Recently, critical theory has undergone a modest resurgence, according to music critic Alex Ross, who writes in The New Yorker, and again, is the other article I included. The internet threatens final confirmation of Adorno and Horkheimer's dictum that the culture industry allows the freedom to choose what is always the same. Champions of online life promised a utopia of infinite availability. A long tail of perpetually in-stock products would revive interest in non-mainstream culture. One not need have read Astra Taylor and other critics the sense that this utopia has been slow in arriving. Culture appears more monolithic than ever, with few gigantic corporations, Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon, presiding over unprecedented monopolies. Internet discourse has become tighter, more coercive. Search engines guide you away from peculiar words. Did you mean, which is true, right? When you write emails and things like that always pop up now. Headlines have an authoritarian bark. This map of planes in the air right now will blow your mind. Most read lists at the top of websites imply that you should read the same stories everyone else is reading. Technology conspires with populism to create an ideologically vacant dictatorship of likes. In many regards, culture industry is the most important legacy of critical theory and seems even more relevant now. Again, I think that is true. I mean, I think it's more or less covers a lot of things that we've gone over beforehand. I'll mostly skip over this section. It sort of speaks more to the difference between how they saw themselves from the so-called vulgar Marxists, and goes a little bit more in depth into their approach to culture. I rely a lot on a book written about the history of the Frankfurt School called The Dialectical Imagination by a guy named Martin Jay. You can see what Jay called the sterile orthodoxy of socialist realism. It's a book worth reading. It came out in the 1970s, but still pretty good interpretation of the Frankfurt School. Mostly skip over this. Not that it's not important, or I don't think it's not unimportant, but I'm gonna try to get through as much as I can. All right. One thing that I think is interesting. So, despite the rigorous standards Adorno brought to his analysis, which I don't think I've talked about much before, but one thing that Adorno brought to his analysis of culture, critical theory is more generous than other critics of consumption, like Thorstein Veblen in his theory of the leisure class. So here Adorno sounds a little more open-minded, maybe, towards mass culture, whereas Veblen, who was an important sociologist in the early part of the 20th century, saw what he termed conspicuous consumption as vulgar and depraved. Theorists like Adorno, while not wholly disagreeing, also saw the genuine desire for true happiness in consumption, and thus at least one redeemable quality. Adorno writes, the happiness that man actually finds cannot be separated from conspicuous consumption. There is no happiness which does not promise to fulfill the socially constituted desire, but there is also none which does not promise something qualitatively different in this fulfillment. Jay elaborates, even the distorted desire for status recognition contained a critical element in its demand, first of all, for real happiness, and secondly, in its recognition that such a condition necessarily included a social component. In this regard, despite being highly critical of mass culture, which again is a term Adorno did not like to use, his analysis represents a more subtle and nuanced take on culture than Veblen's, who Adorno criticized for its shallowness and strong puritanical ascetic quality. So what I get out of this is that what Adorno is saying here is that, the idea that people want to be happy and that it is something important, right? The people are, that their lives have, meaning and worth and dignity to them, that they want to be treated like a human being and they want to find some enjoyment out of life because, unless you believe that we all go float up on a cloud after we die, I mean, there is a kind of existential urgency to that, right? Or we get reincarnated or something like that. There is a kind of urgency to, enjoying life while you still can. And he sees, that the people are largely, of course, conditioned to seek that happiness through consumption, which is a misguided idea, he would say, and I would agree with, but it at least does speak to the idea that people, are trying to find happiness in life. They're just maybe don't know really where, the right way to go about it, per se. And to a large extent, that's not really their fault because, again, they're conditioned almost basically since birth to seek happiness in, the ways that are presented to them, even though those ways are largely unfulfilling. Okay, I mentioned, that, Adorno, Marcuse's essay, Liberation from the Affluent Society, doesn't, seems, almost quaint in the context of the, decay of American life since the 1980s. Jay argues, who's more or less, in line with Adorno and Horkheimer and Marcuse, that Marxists only define true happiness as economic well-being. He doesn't provide any sources for that. And, what's wrong with wanting economic well-being? So I cite, Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I mean, obviously there are higher needs in life besides material security. But Maslow, and I believe many other psychologists would argue that, of course, economic well-being is the precondition for those higher needs, right? Economic well-being is a prerequisite towards higher needs. But without basic needs fulfilled, it is impossible to fulfill these higher needs. So they seem to almost look down on the fact that people, or that Marxist theorists, place a high emphasis on economic well-being. And it's like, well, yeah, you kind of need that, right, to pursue the so-called higher needs, which is, creative fulfillment and, things like that. But without those basic needs fulfilled, you can't really, pursue those other needs. So it does seem a little strange that they kind of seem to dismiss that idea or sort of look down upon it a little bit. Talk a little bit about Lukács, some of Lukács's ideas on literature, which I won't go into that much. Lukács was very much, an advocate of so-called realism in literature, very dismissive towards so-called modernist writers like Proust, Samuel Beckett, James Joyce, William Faulkner, Franz Kafka, Fyodor Dostoevsky, various other people. Adorno much more an advocate of those so-called modernist writers. Schoenberg, someone we've already talked about. I played a little sample of his music. Jay writes about Adorno's approach to Schoenberg and this idea of atonal music. Schoenberg's development of the possibilities of atonality, Adorno argued, expressed a refusal to compromise with the unresolved dissonances of contemporary society. The content of his early expressionist period pointed away from false reconciliations. With the unself-consciousness of the true artist, Schoenberg allowed his own unconscious impulses to express their contradictions. Since, however, atonality sought to avoid tonality at all costs, it led away from pure arbitrariness into a new order based on the 12-tone row, which prohibited the repetition of any note until all 12 had been sounded. In so progressing, Schoenberg had objectified his subjective impulses in a way that put him in touch with the classical tradition. The articulation of the new 12-tone order was a dialectical product of his earlier music, not a short-circuited imposition of order from without. By withdrawing into the logic of music itself, Schoenberg was able to protect himself somewhat from the external pressures of social forces. Now, if you remember, several weeks ago, I played some samples of Schoenberg's music, as well as Berg, Alban Berg, who was a student of Schoenberg. So I won't go into that again, but it does kind of give you a sort of, philosophical, interpretation of what Schoenberg was doing in that music. And again, it's music. It doesn't have lyrics, but the tone of the music, the sort of melancholy tone of it, I think does kind of speak to that, again, sort of protesting against a petrified society. And it also sort of shows you what Schoenberg as an artist is trying to do, is that he's trying to, he's building on what came before him, right? So you have Mozart, Beethoven, and all those various other composers that existed before him and have already sort of experimented with different musical forms and compositions and things like that. How can you sort of bring that forward? How can you be sort of progressive and sort of develop that more? His response was to develop this, 12-tone row, which is basically sort of, again, building upon what came before him. Adorno would later criticize in the 1950s that even that technique had become kind of formulaic by that point, and that you shouldn't be so, rigidly, conforming to one technique over the other, which, is an interesting idea. Won't spend too much more time talking about that. I mean, Adorno, in fact, did actually compose some pieces himself. I think his idea is that you should be able to sort of move back and forth between tonality and atonality. Not everything has to be atonal, not everything has to, correspond with the traditional ideas of tonality. All right, so in the preceding section, I tried to build up a case that, Adorno seemed kind of open-minded towards culture. But when it comes then to dealing with, actual specific instances of mass culture, he seems very dismissive, very elitist, very famously towards jazz music, had nothing good to say about jazz, basically. Very critical of film, disparagingly refers to Orson Welles, one of the few references he gives to dialectic of enlightenment. Unlike Adorno, Wells was radical in the sense that he had the idea that the population was capable of appreciating the highest art, combining technical sophistication and innovation with thematic complexity, but that's rejected by all these so-called leftist thinkers, as well as by the patronizing and condescending attitude of cultural producers today, who dumb down and treat their audiences like children. So Wells did think that, yeah, you could produce things in a popular format and challenge people, but that, people would respond to that. And to be honest, it didn't exactly work out well for him, although a lot of that may have been due to the intervention of people like William Randolph Hearst. But at least he tried. And, later on, he did kind of gain that kind of reputation. I don't know how familiar people are today with Wells's films. I suspect that maybe not a lot of people watch them anymore. But I'll take his approach any day, over Adorno, who's just completely dismissive over, all aspects of mass culture, as well as by people who still produce stuff within mass culture, who basically just treat their audiences like they're idiots, basically, or treat them like, like children, and condescend to them, and, don't allow for any kind of, subtlety or, complexity at all. The elitism of critical theory also signals trends that have undermined the efficacy of Marxist theory for political praxis. Marx's famous phrase, "the philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways, the point is to change it," is inverted by Adorno, who writes, "Philosophy, which once seemed obsolete, lives on because the moment to realize it was missed." This contemplative theoretical stance speaks to the reduction of Marxist theory to an academic affair rather than a movement of the working class. Marcuse shares Adorno's dismissal of the working class. Marcuse goes so far to declare labor to be the enemy, who stands with the representatives of the old order who can no longer protect its life without sacrificing it in the work of destruction and waste and pollution. They now include the representatives of organized labor, correctly so, to the extent to which employment within the capitalist prosperity depends on the continued defense of the established social system. However, this analysis is based on Marcuse's obsolete concept of the affluent society, which, as mentioned, is no longer relevant, and even in the 1960s, exaggerated the alleged reactionary tendencies of the working class. Instead of the proletariat, Marcuse suggests intellectuals, including student protesters, could, if not become a new revolutionary class, at least play a crucial political role. To the degree to which organized labor operates in defense of the status quo, and to the degree to which the share of labor in the material process of production declines, intellectual skills and capabilities become social and political factors. However, the notion the intelligentsia could take on the mantle as the vehicle for social change has proven to be a failure, as substantive social reform has stalled and even regressed for decades, although serving reactionaries well and giving them ammunition for their bromides against the elite while they shamelessly portray themselves as populist. Over the same period as the Democratic Party shed itself of the working class and become a party of the, quote, professional classes, increasingly moved to the right, and is now essentially a conservative or center-right political party. So that's, again, sort of building on this argument here. And then, the next paragraph, I talk about David Remnick's and Jeffrey Goldberg's editorials, supporting the war in Iraq, which are published in the New Yorker. Goldberg failed upwards to become editor of the Atlantic. I even mentioned Art Spiegelman quitting the New Yorker after 2002 and things like that. The article by Michael Tomasky, The Economic Facts of How Great the Biden Administration Is, blah, blah, blah. I mean, this is stuff I've already said. Even Habermas supported the first Gulf War in 91, the NATO bombing of Serbia in 1999. So yeah, I try to build, the argument that, critical theory has, for the most part, become a, monopolized by the intellectual classes and has sort of moved away from the working class. And that is where I think it should basically go back to. And again, there is importance in, having an understanding of mass culture. So it's not like I don't think anything that Adorno and Horkheimer have contributed is meaningless, but that I think that they have, kind of gone off in a different direction maybe that they should have gone. Maybe that's understandable for the context that they lived in, but where we are now, 50 years later or so, I think there's more of a need to return back to the kind of, working class idea of politics. And then, then I start to bring in some of these other so-called vulgar Marxist theorists. and try to show that, well, actually they have a pretty good idea of mass culture. They talk about John Lennon, they talk about popular movies, Casablanca, Alfred Hitchcock movies, things like that, Orson Welles. All right, so I think what I'm going to do though, if there are no objections, I don't think we'll have class on Thursday. I think we'll just end things here, give people extra time to work on their articles and stuff, work on their papers, I mean. I've pretty much covered, most of what I want to get to. I mean, believe me, I'd like to spend, so much time talking about myself, but I think you pretty much get the idea of the article. After this section, I bring in Walter Benjamin, talk a little bit about him. But I think, you pretty much get the gist of it. So we more or less end things here. There is an assignment for this week. You can choose, the due date for the paper is on the syllabus, which is posted here. Let me switch over. Um, 5/11. So email me the paper. The paper is my email address is here, beamerdocco@rutgers.edu. If anyone has any questions between now and then, I'm available to meet, or if you want to write me an email, I can obviously answer you that way. Otherwise, I think that's pretty much it. I mean, pretty much that was sort of my way of wrapping up, summarizing basically most of the stuff that we talked about during the semester. I hope you got something out of it. I do think it's dense reading for the most part, but I do think there's a lot of interesting things there. And that's it. So does anyone have any questions for me or comments about anything else? All right, then I guess we can end things here. Again, we won't have class on Thursday. So take care, everyone, and have a good rest of the semester and everything else.
Professor?